they really going to suffer any consequences? Probably not, but it's probably a good like framework to build your your program off of, and then stress test it and find like what you want to kind of adjust within that. But yeah, so
Did they find anything weird in his bloods and stuff?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And I have to look at it more
Yeah, I'll
closely.
have to read that. I haven't read that one. So.
Yeah. So it's interesting though, just to hear because the ultra running community is way more open about what they're doing. For whatever reason, it's been more. I think it's just kind of been like in its early days, it was kind of more, since everything's anecdotes for the most part, you know, a lot of it anyway, it was just one of those things where it's like, hey man, what are you doing? Oh, I tried this. It's like, oh, you got a cramp, try pickle juice, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So like, it's just been part of the sport for so long where you kind of just like share what you're doing. And my guess is some of that's probably kind of pulled back with certain athletes anyway, because there is a financial consequence now. There is a professional career path with it, and just like cycling and just like Tour de France, once there's money on the line, people start kind of keeping to themselves a little more. I find with what they're
especially
doing.
with like the smaller niches at first. It's and I've noticed, especially if there's not a path to make a fair amount of money.
Yeah,
people realize we're not doing this to make a ton of money, and
Right.
like, oh wow, you're a weirdo just like me. Hey,
Yeah,
great. Like,
it's
what
fun.
do you do? You know, it's
Storytelling,
like more
yeah.
of a bonding story time, exchange war stories type thing.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's some interesting stuff there, but
Yeah, and Brent Ruby has published some stuff with looking at metabolic rates sustained in firefighters for how long you can have an elevated metabolic rate just due to work. And so there appears to be, and I can't remember the numbers, but there appears to be an upper limit to just how much work capacity as a human you can do on a repeated day-to-day basis.
oh really?
Yeah, which
Okay.
kind of makes sense, right? There has to be some limit. Like, did you think about racing? Like, you do a 100-mile race. If you had to repeat that the next day, it's not going to be nearly as good, right?
Right,
So there's going
yeah.
to be some threshold there of how much you can actually do over short periods of time.
Yeah. No, that would make sense. Yeah, it's interesting then when you look at like some of these like long projects, like fastest known times on like the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail or Transcon stuff, where there was just the women's Transcon record just got broken.
Oh, really?
And it was, I hope I remember this right. I think she hit like 66 miles a day, which is a big boost on the women's side, because the overall record 72 and a half. But before that, I think the women's record was maybe right at 60 or maybe a shade under. So she took a pretty good chunk out of that. But yeah, so it's like whatever that workload is, it's still pretty high, I guess.
Do you think females have an advantage over time as races get longer? Because I haven't looked at the exact stats, but it appears that you see more women winning at longer races compared to shorter races, but I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, the data would suggest at the moment that there's an equal gap, essentially, but as you'd get to with like the marathon and that stuff, that roughly like kind of like 8 to around 10%. You do get a few more, you get like kind of what I would consider these kind of outlier ones where that range gets tightened, but those are often events that are just like highly untested in the sense that like, whether it's by numbers or by just like where the talent in the sport has focused their time and energy, it's just not like really good examples of what I would consider like a highly tested event to the degree where we're really probably pulling accurate data from it. So then if we would actually push everyone towards that one event, my suspicion is they would start to get closer to what it is with the other events. I do think there's probably some potential there though, especially when you get into some of the really long stuff like weeks and that sort of thing, where there's just less reason to believe that there would necessarily be a female biological like deterrent there, that, you know, who knows that. Well, and here's the argument against what I just said too, and especially in ultra running, there's a massive disparity in participant numbers too.
That's what I was wondering
Yeah, because I think it's like something to the tune of 70-30, 80-20 or something like that.
Oh, okay.
So you also have
the more males are just doing the period.
Yeah, so you just have a bigger data pool to pull from, or more attempts, essentially, more reps. And in a sport where like you have limited reps because there's only so many of these things you can do, it does matter when you have like more reps within your group, I guess, to kind of even just trial and error things and figure out where that, or just set the standard too. And then there's the whole like, just, you know how it is, like someone breaks a record, now all of a sudden that's the mark, and then people who otherwise would have never expected to go after that mark are now targeting that, and then they do it. I mean, we saw that with the women's Olympic trials qualifying standard, I think, where they moved it from 245 to 237.
Wow.
A pretty big drop. And the number suggested they needed a pretty healthy drop because it was getting skewed way heavy towards female qualifiers were outpacing male qualifiers by a large margin. So there needed to be some adjustments. And I think when people first saw that, like, that's too big of an adjustment, you're going to totally stamp out the sport, or the whole like, well, what happens to that collegiate athlete who was like 245s in target, I'm going to keep going, versus 237, I'm never going to hit that, why bother trying type of a scenario. That didn't seem to play out. It seemed like a lot of the women just said, all right, 237 is where I need to be, and they got to work. And we've seen it's definitely dropped, the qualifying numbers, but it's actually, I think, I'd have to double check this, but I think it's pretty balanced out now between the men and the women. So if that was what they were trying to do, then they accomplished it.
And how much of that do you think is just, you have a target, right? So to qualify, I have to be under the 245. Now I have to be under 237. So you just back up everything from there with the new target. And obviously at some point that's not going to work if it's like everyone has to run a sub 2 hour marathon or whatever. It's not going to work. But if it's within that range where it's physiologically possible, now all your training can be specific towards that new number.
Yep. And I think that's probably what it was. There was probably a lot of people there was probably a healthy number of people who just saw, 245 is the number, so why bother outperforming it?
Right.
Because if your goal is to get to the Olympic trials and that gets you in, let's say you're someone who's going to run like a 243, you're not thinking about, all right, next step's the Olympics. You're thinking about, I'm going to do the trials. That is my Olympics.
Right.
But then they make that number 237. So now maybe you start structuring your workouts around the 237 target and then see what happens. And then, some do it and some don't. You get a lower list, but I think I thought there would be less qualifiers than actually ended up occurring so far. So, it's interesting though. So I guess like maybe the thing to think about with ultra running then would be, how do we sort of normalize higher expectations for the women's field to the degree where we can start potentially seeing if there is a different gap there? Because who knows, maybe it is, or maybe it's not a closing of the gap, but it's like a 4% difference, which would be a lot tighter than what we're seeing in like the marathon or any of the Olympic distances.